Hey folks, it's Dr. Gilchrist, and today we are beginning our 2 weeks of being asynchronous. I'm kind of caught up here in the yellow, so at least temporarily I'm going to move my head over here. We also have a very special guest. Earl is purring on my lap, and he is looking forward to being here with you and talking about speech perception and reading. So you'll kind of notice that in your syllabus, there is supposed to be a section on speaking. And it turns out that as I read through the chapter, really the big critical things that you need to know when we talk about speaking is that there is a lot of planning involved, and there's often a trade-off between planning and speech errors. So I'm going to keep the speaking emphasis basically down to one slide that I think is probably one of the more important aspects of this. So let's go ahead and begin. So let's briefly talk a little bit about speaking before we move into comparisons between understanding spoken speech or spoken words through speech versus reading them out loud and understanding written communication through text. So one of the things that we're going to find is that speech often comes out very, very effortlessly for us. And part of the reason that this happens is because of a process known as pre-formulation. So for a lot of us, what we are going to find is that we have stock phrases or statements or things like that that we have often repeated, often in advance to help us formulate the next things that we plan to say. So if you notice that you have certain turns of phrase that you like to use a lot, basically is one of mine, or as we talked about last time. So one of the things that you're often going to find is that especially for people who are very, very quick speakers, so people who are watching things like horse races or they're auctioneers, they are often going to be repeating a lot of the same statements over and over again because they're expected to speak quickly and they don't often have time to plan. And it's been suggested that, at least according to your textbook, that about 70% of our speech is actually made up of word combinations that we use repeatedly. Now, some other things that we tend to find can simplify our understanding of language is the use of monologue. And this is how your book spelled it, so I suspect it's a little bit different from a dramatic monologue, monologue. But the idea is that with a monologue, you can speak your thoughts to somebody, and that actually tends to work a lot easier for planning what you want to say than something like a dialogue where you actively have to listen to what the other person is saying and then basically try to interact and structure your planning and what you want to say around what another person just said. When you're doing a monologue, all you have to do is think about what you want to get across and less about how you're going to interact with this other person. So a lot of us do also have a bit of a tendency to monologue. One of the other things that we find that often happens with language is we do things like under specification. So when I say, I hope that you read last week's section on logical fallacies. I will be asking you about them later. The them in that case is an under specification. Ideally, if you've been listening to me, you will know that the them in this case refers to the logical fallacies, but I can also cut down on phrases or things that I want to say by under specifying certain parts of that language. Now, one of the other things that I will briefly talk about before we move into talking about speech perception is what this planning process tends to look like, at least theoretically. So theoretically, we typically will start with a semantic processing level. So we're going to think about what kind of meaning or what kind of message that we want to convey. At that point, once we are doing this, we will then begin engaging in syntactic processing. So at least here in our language, we have a specific grammar, we have a specific word order. For example, the English language is what is called an SO or SVO language. So typically the structure of our language follows as a subject, followed by a verb, and then an object. So then once you've kind of planned out the order of the words, at that point you are going to engage in what is called morphemic processing. So this is when we think about the vocabulary that we want to use, the specific type of word that we want to use. So we will probably focus more on what is called a morpheme. So a morpheme is basically the smallest unit that actually carries meaning. So for example, a lot of one-syllable words tend to basically be one morpheme. That is not always the case. Your book uses the example that the word balls is actually two morphemes. So in this case, we have the word ball, and then when we add the word s, that actually makes it plural. So we have the actual item and then the fact that it's plural. That is technically two morphemes rather than one. So we go from semantic to syntactic to morphemic. So we go from overarching meaning, overarching goal, syntactic order, vocabulary, and the proper positioning, and then finally how we want to actually sound that out. So we're going to be talking about the phonological process. Now, just as morphemes carry the smallest unit of meaning, a phoneme contains the smallest unit of sound. So it is basically a sound syllable. In American English, just as in British English, as your book notes, your authors are British, which explains a lot, but there are 44 different phonemes. And so we are constantly operating on these different levels. I would argue that a lot of these are kind of happening in parallel, which is part of the reason why you see certain types of errors when people have difficulty finding the word that they want to find. And there is going to be a trade-off between how much planning you do and what kind of mistakes you make. So the more planning that you do in advance, the fewer mistakes you're going to make. In contrast, if you are basically speaking on the fly, you are doing less planning ahead of time, you're doing more planning in the moment, and that means you're going to end up making more mistakes as a result. And those are really the key kind of things that I wanted you to think about with respect to speaking. So now let's talk about some of the differences between reading and speech. So reading and speech are very, very similar processes, but they do have some differences as well. So if we talk about reading, this is something that, at least evolutionarily speaking, is incredibly recent. Additionally, when we are reading, we separate sentences and phrases and clauses and idea units through punctuation marks. And punctuation marks can actually be very, very ambiguous. So, for example, if somebody makes a certain type of statement that is a question, is that a legitimately meant question, or is it a sarcastic question? So the punctuation marks don't always do a very good job of containing meaning or indicating tone. Additionally, as I'm kind of speaking to you right now, you'll notice that I have a natural rising and falling intonation of my voice. And additionally, before I add another thought, I usually will take a pause of some kind. So you'll notice that the pause is a bit shorter when I'm still working within a sentence, but it will often be longer when I'm separating one sentence from another, as you might find with a period. Additionally, one of the other things that you will find is that my speech tends to go up toward the middle of the sentence, and then once I hit the middle of the sentence, we hit this downward tone. And so this rising and falling intonation as you read a sentence, these are what are known as prosodic cues. So I am helping you figure out how to segment this very, very long string of speech by different aspects of my voice and my intonation. Reading doesn't really have that. Now compare that to speech perception. So speech perception makes a greater demand on memory. Now, if I forget something that I've read, I can go back and I can read it. I can't necessarily always do that when I am listening to somebody talk. Speech itself is an ambiguous signal. If you don't have an understanding of the language, it is going to be very difficult for you to segment things out, and we'll talk a little bit about these aspects. Additionally, information is spread out throughout the sentence, and additionally, it's transitory. Once I've spoken an utterance, unless I choose to repeat myself, you are not going to be able to hear that again unless it's been recorded for you. So this makes it very, very transitory. So we're going to start by talking about speech perception, and then we will also talk about reading. So speech perception basically works in these kinds of steps. So initially, the speech signal is a long string of auditory input. So you're getting this auditory input. This is your speech signal. Now, oftentimes when you are hearing speech, there are other noises going on in the background. There's other types of noise. So you first of all have to decode the signal. This involves selecting speech from that background and then transforming it from this speech signal into a larger abstract representation. Now, once you've decoded the signal as speech and you're beginning to process it, at this point, you are then capable of segmenting that sequence into smaller words and phrases. So this will require some word recognition. So you're going to basically have words that you think you heard, those will be activated. You will retrieve lexical information. Sometimes there can be competition. From there, once you've recognized words, you are going to start processing the syntax of what was said, and you're also going to process the larger themes that you notice. You're going to pay attention to tone and the story that they're trying to tell you. And then finally, you are able to integrate this into a larger discourse model, an understanding of what this person was trying to tell you. Now, this discourse model is going to be more focused on the overall meaning of what was said rather than the exact proper phrasing. So that's going to become really important too. So this is basically one idea for how this works. Now, if you actually look at a speech signal, if you have auditory recording software like I do, one of the things that's kind of interesting is that if you look at the speech signal, there are not clear pauses between words. Rather, what you're going to find is that each phoneme, because these are based on phonemes, this is speech, we're basing this on units of sound, each phoneme blends into the previous one. So this is a spectrogram of the sentence, Joe took father's shoe bench out. So here we actually have the different phonemes printed on the bottom, along with the spectrogram for that specific phoneme. So here's J, so that's what this means, it's J. And then you'll notice that there's not a clear separation between J and O. So these are kind of bleeding in together. This is something that we're going to talk about a little bit more called co-articulation. So when we start to make one syllable sound, our mouth is already getting ready to prepare for the next phoneme that we have to make. And so because of that, they bleed into each other. The J in Joe is going to sound different from the J in jail. And that's because we're already starting to get to the O sound in Joe, and we're beginning to mouth the E sound in ale. So these kind of bleed into each other. So here's Joe took father's shoe, this is shoe, bench out. And so you can kind of see that there's not a clear separation between each of these words. It's one long signal. And so this makes parsing the speech signal very, very difficult. So what are some problems that we have to deal with when we are listening to speech? And one of the first things that is an immediate obstacle is the speech rate. Speech and understanding speech requires very, very rapid processing. So if you've ever been to a foreign country, and you kind of speak some of the language, but maybe not very well, one of the things that you are going to find is that it feels like they are talking much, much faster. And the thing to really appreciate is that you similarly talk your native language very, very quickly. The only reason that you don't realize that is because you are an expert in your native language. Now, somebody from a foreign country who would listen to you talk would think that you were talking too fast because they're trying to segment much, much slower. Their understanding of a foreign language is going to be much, much slower than your speaking rate. Now, the good news is that we can understand up to 50 to 60 phonemes per second. So that's very, very useful. But one of the other big problems that we have to deal with is what's called the segmentation problem. How do we actually separate and distinguish words from the overall long string of speech? How do we figure out where the boundaries for each of these words are when the speech signal is as continuous as it is? So let's talk about some rules of thumb that we use to help us here. Here are some other problems to consider. First of all, as I kind of mentioned, co-articulation. The phoneme is going to sound different based on the phonemes that you immediately used before and the ones that are immediately coming after. So for example, the B in bell is going to be slightly different than the B that we make for ball. So bell versus ball. Now they don't sound different, but if we took a spectrogram, we would probably notice that the B in bell versus the B in ball is actually sounding slightly different because we're preparing for that other vowel sound. In one case it's eh, and in another case it's ah. And because of that, that's going to affect the B sound that we make. So that's co-articulation. One of the other problems that we have, and by the way, we can actually use co-articulation and our understanding of co-articulation to make predictions about what is coming next, and we can actually use this to help us segment. So as much of a problem as it is, it's actually pretty useful. One of the other problems that we need to consider is that there are individual differences in our speech rates. Some people talk really, really quickly. Other ones do not. And then finally, oftentimes when we are processing speech, we are not in a sound-free environment. So there are instances where we are listening to speech that is severely degraded, and we actively have to basically try to eliminate environmental noise from that speech signal so that we can understand it. So these are a lot of problems that we deal with anytime that we're listening to somebody else talk. Now, one of the other tricky things that we can find is that your eyes actually can end up fooling your ears. One of the things that actually helps us when we're processing speech is that we use lip reading for additional information. And so this is a case where auditory and visual information is blended together. So a very famous finding that kind of relates to this is something called the McGurk effect. So I'm going to try to do this, so I'm kind of moving away from the slide so you can kind of see my mouth movements here, because this is going to be kind of critical as to how the McGurk effect works. So really quick, I'm going to make the word, I'm going to basically make the sound ba, ba, ba. And so one of the things, if you want to try that, go ahead and try to sound out the word ba just really quickly. And what you're going to notice is that your lips are going to purse outward. So ba, ba. This is what's called a labial stop. So the B sound is actually placed at the lips, and then we briefly actually stop the flow of air. So we call this a labial stop because it's placed at the lips and it completely blocks airflow. So ba, ba. And it's also placed at the front of the mouth. Now I would like you to try ga, ga, ga. Now what you're probably noticing is that the tongue is hitting very far back in the roof of your mouth. So we're going ga, ga. So one of the things you'll find is that your tongue is actually hitting the back of your soft palate at the very roof of your mouth. The other thing that you're going to notice is that your mouth is very wide open. So compare ba at the front of the mouth to ga at the very back of the mouth. Ga, ga, ga. So here's where the McGurk effect comes in. So I can show you a video of me making the ba sound. So ba, ba, ba. But what we do is we take the ga sound that I made at the very back of the mouth, and we basically superimpose the ga sound over the B sound that you're actually watching me do. So you're watching me say ba, but it sounds like ga. So we basically took the sound ga and we superimposed it over the sight of me going ba, ba. Now here's what's interesting. Your auditory information, the ga, and the visual information, in this case the ba, actually combine. And most people will report hearing something like va, which is actually kind of voiced in the middle of the mouth rather than the front like ba or the very back of the mouth like ga. So we end up getting this combination of sounds. So you can look up some really interesting findings with the McGurk effect. Your auditory and visual information is blended, and this involves both a combination of top-down and bottom-up processing. So we're bottom-up processing that speech signal, but we're using our understanding of what mouth movements look like for certain words to help us figure out what somebody's trying to tell us. So I think that's pretty interesting. So how do we end up doing this segmentation in addition to using lip reading to help us? So we use our knowledge of our native language. So for example, in English, certain sounds never actually appear together within a particular syllable. In English, M and R, mr, never appear together in the same syllable. So if we hear them, so mr, would suggest that M is the end of a boundary of a word like arm, and then R is where a new word begins. So arm ring, ring. That probably suggests that there is a boundary between our words. Additionally, we do have a pretty good understanding that there are some word constraints about what is permissible and what is not permissible. In English, you generally do not have a stretch of speech vowels that do, or speech sounds that do not have a vowel. At some point, if you're getting a bunch of consonants, one right after the other, at some point, you need to have a vowel. And if you don't, that's probably not a word that you are actually listening to. Or if it is a word, it's definitely not in your native language. So the other things that we do are we also utilize syllabic stress. So in English, generally what we're going to find is that intonation becomes really critical. Oftentimes we're going to find that the initial syllables of most content words are going to be stressed more than later syllables. So if you hear an area that has a particular stress, odds are that is the beginning of a new word boundary. So notice when you hear me talk, notice that I put additional stress on the beginning of words rather than the ending. And then additionally, our understanding that co-articulation happens can also help us make predictions on what is coming next. So if I hear a particular B sound, I can potentially make a prediction on whether I'm going to hear the vowel sound ah, I, or eh very, very soon, just based on the way that that particular B is sounded. So we can actually use co-articulation, which is a problem in and of itself, to help us make predictions about what we expect later. Now, we tend to use lexical, word-based information the most when we are processing the speech signal, when we are segmenting. So here we have our basis for segmentation. So we have our lexical, and then we have our sublexical. So oftentimes we are going to use things like word-based content, our knowledge of words to basically help us segment that information. So in addition to using words, we also use the context of the sentence. That includes the syntax. Odds are pretty good at the very beginning of a sentence that we're going to hear a subject rather than a verb first, because our language is a subject, verb, object language. We can use semantics, so the overall meaning of the word. So if I'm on a boat, odds are pretty good I'm going to be hearing a lot of boat-based words. And pragmatics kind of fits with that as well. What kind of message am I trying to convey? What kind of context am I in? I can prepare for what sort of words I might hear based on that top-down context. We also use our knowledge of words to help us. So we, by and large, use our greater understanding of words to help us parse this signal. Now, in other cases, we can use things like co-articulation to segment or word stress, but generally what we're going to find is that segmental information based on phonetics, like co-articulation, that doesn't really give us a lot of information about words. In contrast, word stress doesn't always give us a very good cue for how to segment things. So we tend to use lexical information the most, and it tends to work the best for us. So one of the things that's actually kind of interesting is that we have a categorical perception when it comes to phonemes. So just as when we talked about the dress back in visual perception, back when we talked about the dress, I kind of mentioned that most people either see it as black and blue or as white and gold. Very few people see a middle ground. They don't see a bluish white or a blackish gold. They either see one or the other. So just as we have categorical perception of visual items, so too do we have categorical perception of the words that we hear. So speech stimuli that are basically stuck between two phonemes like t and duh, they're going to be categorized as one or the other. You're not going to hear something in the middle like t. You're going to either hear t or you're going to hear d. You are not going to hear something in the middle. You have to have a dividing line. Most of us have our own dividing line, but we don't hear something in the middle of t and d. We either hear t or we hear d. So we have these very clear, abrupt boundaries, just as we saw for color perception. Now, what's interesting is that we can even distinguish between slightly different sounds of the same phoneme. So, for example, in 1974, Dave Pisoni and Jeffrey Tash presented participants with speech sounds that basically ranged perceptually from ba to pa. And so listeners were basically given different segments such as ba ba or pa pa. So they had to respond same if both of those stimuli in a pair came from the same phoneme, or they were told to respond different if they were different phonetic segments such as pa ba or ba pa. So what Pisoni and Tash actually found is that the reaction time for those same responses tended to be faster for identical stimuli than for different stimuli. And generally the RT, the reaction time for those different responses, tended to be larger for differences that crossed a boundary, such as going from P to B, rather than two different types of P, for example. So it was faster for these larger auditory differences across a phonetic boundary. So like I said, P to B, than if you were doing slightly different enunciations of the P sound. So we can actually distinguish between slightly different sounds of the same phoneme and notice that they're different. And it will take us longer time to do so, but it is something we can actually parse. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and we will pick up and talk more about speech perception on the next one.